Hi, my name is Danny Fleming of MA Properties Real Estate. Wanted to talk about what happens if the buyer exits the contract. Wow, how long is a piece of string? It depends. It depends. It depends on two basic things, whether the buyer defaults or whether the buyer exits based on a contingency. So let's talk about the buyer exiting based on a contingency first, because that's a fairly straightforward one. There are two typically in typical contracts. There is an inspection contingency and a mortgage contingency. There are other contingencies there that can be added, but most of those are uncommon. They're not the typical ones. Let me just put it that way. And at those two contingencies, you typically have a different amount of money in escrow. The buyer has the amount of money in escrow. But if they exit based on those two contingencies, the buyer gets the deposit, the money in escrow, returned to them. Because they haven't defaulted. They have exited the contract based on a contingency. And there's a whole lot more to that, as well as what those contingencies are, and you'll find those in other Selling Essential videos. But if the buyer defaults, the buyer can default at any point up from offer acceptance to closing. And it does depend on where they are defaulting in that transaction. If they're defaulting between offer and purchase and sale, typically they will have a $1,000 amount in escrow, unless you've got a savvy real estate agent, a savvy seller's agent like me. If there's no inspection contingency, I ask for a $10,000 initial deposit, and I've got other videos that explain all of that too, as to why, etc. But in that phase prior to purchase and sale, there is not as much money in escrow as what there is after purchase and sale to closing. But the buyer can default at any point in time in that. If there's $1,000 in escrow, well, first off, I should explain, if a buyer defaults, no, money that's held in escrow, legally, the buyer and the seller have to agree as to the disposition of the funds. They have to agree. You can't just sort of say, I want it, and the attorneys or the whoever's holding the funds in escrow can just give it to those people. They have to get agreement from both sides. If it's $1,000, and that's in that first window until purchase and sale, not the $10,000, the seller's attorney, your attorney, might say, you know what, the buyers want it, you want it. By the time we email, the attorneys email backwards and forwards, the $1,000 is gone. You know, if they go backwards and forwards trying to get the money for you, the money's gone. You may as well just give it back, because that's not a standard fee. That's not a standard thing that an attorney factors into their fee of offer acceptance to closing. So you do have to pay for that service. If it's a $10,000 initial deposit, yeah, the attorney's going to fight for you to get that money back. If the buyer, once the buyer hits purchase and sale, typically there is 5% deposit, 5% of the sale price in escrow. And you will potentially have the buyer, for whatever reason they're defaulting, they are understanding they are at risk of losing the money that is in escrow. And it does happen. I had a situation where Actually, I've had two situations where the buyer didn't turn up to closing, and one of them, we didn't know until the day of closing that they weren't coming, and the other one we found out about the day before closing that they weren't coming. And in those circumstances, well, one of them understood that he was losing the 5%, and they agreed that the seller, the attorney, got the buyer's attorney to send over basically, I understand I'm losing the money, and then that money was given to the sellers. The second instance happened just a year ago. The buyer didn't turn up to closing, told us the day beforehand that they weren't going to close on the home. And unfortunately, this is where the value of an agent who's representing the seller or the buyer is so important, so important. This particular agent, the buyer's agent, works for a company, and I'm not going to name names, but works for a company where they will offer a rebate back to the buyer or the seller. And when she told me the day before that the buyer wasn't going to move forward, I said, have you talked to the buyer about the fact that they're going to lose their deposit? This is 5%. This is a lot of money. It was around $60,000. And she said, it's not my responsibility. I don't need to tell them. And I said, but you know that they're going to lose their deposit. Do they know this? She said, well, it's not my, and I'm just, oh my goodness, Anyway, I then was appealing to another part of the agent where the buyers were under the misunderstanding or the misunderstanding that something wasn't disclosed to them. And the agent just basically said, look, they signed a piece of paper. It's not up to me to explain what that piece of paper is. Anyway, that buyer, unfortunately, because they weren't led and had all of the paperwork explained to them along the way, and nobody was paying attention to the buyers, which is really sad. They ended up trying to fight to get the money back, and I think they ended up going to arbitration, and I think they got $10,000 back, and they lost the rest. I don't know the specific details, but that's a really sad instance, and occasionally we see that happen. So if a buyer exits the contract by defaulting, they are under a very real risk of losing the money that's in escrow. But what happens to you? Let's go back to what happens to you, because this is what this is meant to be all about. If a buyer exits the contract, well, we have two options. One option is to come back on the market as soon as possible, which means typically, depending on when the buyer has exited, your home might be vacant. You've already moved out because, the day of closing they've defaulted. You may have already moved out. We can turn on a dime and we'll get a whole house full of furniture into your home, get some photos done again, and quickly get you on the market as soon as possible. It does depend on the season. For instance, if you were meant to close the 20th of December, and this all fell through, it depends on your circumstances and what your need for the money is. If you've already got somewhere that you've moved to, you already own another home, etc., with that, then it is very much a case of Maybe we don't want to come on the 20th or 21st or 22nd of December. Maybe we're better off to wait 4 weeks and come on the end of January, where there are going to be more buyers out in the marketplace. Or we can just come back on straight away. What it also means is if it's the day of closing and you have another sale, another purchase, that you are buying and you need those funds, it might mean that you have to scramble to get bridging finance, something like this, that can tide you over until we sell your home again, because otherwise, if you have to pull out of your purchase because your buyer pulled out of the purchase of your home, then you're defaulting on the other one. So you're going to lose the money that you've got down. So, there's a whole complicated scenario of what happens the later it is in the transaction that the buyer defaults. If it happens, in the first week or two of your home going under agreement, there's a whole lot more things that we can do and things. So each situation is specific to that situation. But it is really important to understand the full ramifications of what goes on and getting your home back on the market as quickly as possible. I hope I didn't complicate that. I hope I didn't complicate that. But what happens if the buyer exits the contract? It depends on where it is in the transaction. But if the buyer is exiting the contract because they're defaulting, then legally, as the seller, you retain their deposit. But they may fight that because both parties have to agree. If they're exiting the contract based on a contingency, those escrow funds go back to the buyer, period. So that sort of summarizes it, I guess. Anyway, we can talk about this in great length because there's so many different scenarios, and I hear so many different stories from people about what happened in their last transaction and things like this. So there's a whole lot to it. But if you'd like to talk about it in more detail and with more questions, then feel free to email me or call me, and I'd love to chat. Anyway, have a great day.